So I'm going to do a short introduction and then I'm going to hand over to Nick. You can ask questions at any time, but first of all, we'd love you to introduce yourselves on the chat, say where you're connecting from and which organisation you are from. I'm Nancy Kinder, and myself with Michael and Judy, we set up the Knowledge and Community Network, a really informal, friendly, but really supportive group of individuals working in knowledge and community management. If you're new, we've had 22 recorded webinars that are all available for you to watch back on YouTube, and we'll put a link in the chat for you to access them. And we did, once upon a time, meet up in the pub. If you're not talking, if you could put yourself on mute, that would be really helpful.
Hello.
I think I can mute all. I could do that. Sorry, everyone.
Because
we'll have to... it's always good to do that through the introduction. Then it doesn't disturb the recording of the speaker. We are recording today's session and we'll share the recording with everyone that's registered and everyone in our little informal group. There's an idea of the sort of topics that we've done before that you have access to. And our goal ultimately is that we don't want you to struggle on your own. We've both been in organisations where there's maybe not the same peer support. So we wanted to provide a forum where you can connect with peers because it helps us, all of us, to be stronger. So I'm going to hand over for Michael and Judy just to introduce themselves, and then we'll start with Nick in a second. Over to you guys. Michael first, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Michael Norton. I work for PlaceCube, look after a thing called Knowledge Hub, which is a public sector community platform. As Nancy mentioned, we've known each other a long time and both work in different organisations, pretty much been the only sort of ones doing knowledge management and community management there. So having people to lean on and I've met most of you guys on here in the past. So it's great to see everyone come back and join us, and for all new people, it's excellent you coming along to Nick's session as well. This is something that I think we've been really interested in over the last few years since Judy first told us about this. And so that we think that will really sort of build a capacity for knowledge management in the area, in everyone's areas of work. Over to you, Judy.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm an independent consultant and writer and researcher specialising in knowledge management. I've been doing it forever. I am the first CILIP Knowledge Management Fellow. I was invited to join the pilot cohort and I completed that earlier this year. Amongst other things, I chair the BSI Knowledge Management Committee, and I'm a member of the ISO working group that developed the standard. And I'm also working with Nick as a member of the drafting panel for the guide that Nick's going to talk about. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I will share my screen and then we can get started.
Welcome, everyone. If you've just joined, it's still helpful for you to introduce yourself on the chat because it helps us know who's on the call and where you're connecting from. Thanks, Nick. We can see that brilliantly.
Okay, good. So our topic today is not the ISO standard, it's the guide to the ISO standard. I'm assuming that most people, if you've joined this webinar, you've got some awareness of the knowledge management standard. And I'll just briefly introduce it, but really the meat of the talk is about the guide to the standard that we are writing now. We would be very interested in your feedback, and we'd be very interested to know if you would like to be involved later when the guide is published. You can ask questions at any point on the chat. I'll try and monitor the chat, but also Judy's going to keep an eye on that to pick up any questions along the way. But let me introduce myself. I think I know many of you, if not personally, by name and by reputation. So it's lovely to see you all. There's some old friends out there and hopefully some new friends. But if the one or two people who don't know me, I actually started life as a geologist, but I moved into knowledge management nearly 30 years ago now. And I've been working since 1999 as a knowledge management consultant with multiple organizations. I'm based in the UK. Like Judy, I was on the ISO working group that wrote the standard. And like Judy, I'm on the BSI drafting team that's drafting the guide to the standard. You can see on the bottom left of the screen there all my contact details if you want to ask anything later, my website, my email address, my blog address, my Twitter handle, and the books that I've written down the bottom of the page. So before we go into any details, we would like to run a quick poll. And the poll is a poll of, I think if you work in knowledge management for an organization, please answer the poll on behalf of the organization. If you work as a consultant, then please think of your most important current client or your favorite client and answer on their behalf. And the poll will give you 10 statements. And at the top of the poll, at the top of the list, there is perhaps the least level of engagement with the standard. At the bottom of the list is the highest level. So please scroll down that list until you can find a statement that reflects what your organization or your client plans to do with the standard. And please click on that. We'll let the poll run for about a minute. And then Nancy, I think can you share the results with us as a pie chart, or do we just look at it?
Yes, I will share them afterwards so everyone can see. I might have to share because there's 10 options, everybody. So yeah, make sure you scroll down and see all of the options. And then I will share the results back with you. Just give it a little bit longer so we can get, you would choose more than one option.
Okay, well, choose the one lowest down the list that you would agree with. Yeah, all of you who would choose more than one option, choose the one lowest down the list that you would agree with.
Right.
It might be different parts of the organisation have different ideas about what to do with the standard.
Might be.
Yeah.
No poll is perfect.
No.
I'm going to end the poll now, and I'm going to share the results. And so I don't think I can show all 10 answers at the same time. We
can scroll down.
We can scroll. Okay.
Can you see it? Can you?
Now, all right, that's interesting. About a quarter there are aware of it, but don't intend to use the standard. The rest intend some sort of use. 14% of you haven't decided what that use would be. And I think the biggest, the most popular answer is that we will use it to inform our internal KM initiative. So you're not planning to audit or review against it. There are 4 of you who are planning to do or have done an internal review. And there's one person out of the 41 who intends to seek certification against the standard. That's interesting. Now, I asked exactly the same question when I did my last global survey of knowledge management. Let's leave that poll up for a moment while I change the slide, because then we can look at it side by side with the global data. This pie chart here is 220 people answered this question. Knowledge managers around the world. About 1/5 were completely unaware of the standard. Now, I'm assuming that doesn't apply to any of you because you're here, you're aware of it. If we take that 1/5 out, I think, well, there we go, 30% were aware of it but didn't intend to use it, which is a little bit more than we've got here. So in this poll, almost half did not intend, were either unaware or didn't intend to use the standard. In our poll, it's a larger proportion intend use. Oops, sorry. I'm just scrolling. So in our poll, it is 24, and it is, yeah, so it's about 1/3, just over 1/3. Don't intend to use it, but the rest of us do. And again, in the big survey, the largest of the quadrant of people using it, if we ignore the I don't knows up here, the 14%, are intending to do just what you guys are doing, what the majority of you are doing, using it to inform the initiative. And I think that's good. And Judy, I imagine you also will be happy that the interest here is not so much about certification. It's not so much about audit, it's about information. And I think that was behind our intention with writing the standard in the first place. Having said that, there are a few people who will do an internal review. And there is one person who intends to seek certification. Now, over here on the big pie chart, there were, I think, 3% intended to seek certification. So there is a market for certification. It's a small market. All right, so use of the standard. We can close the poll now. Do we do that for ourselves? Click on it.
Yeah, I've stopped it now, but then people can click on it themselves too.
Before I go and talk about the guide, I'm going to give you 5 overview slides about the standard itself, and then we'll collect a little bit of questions and feedback after that. The standard. It's not a standard way to do knowledge management. That would be crazy. There is no standard way to do knowledge management. It's not an attempt to make everybody do stuff the same way. It's certainly not a consultant's charter to print money. I wish it were, but it's not. It is certainly not a requirement for accreditation or certification. You can, and some of you do want to be certified, but you don't have to be. What it is a set of standards for a management system around knowledge management. So it's looking purely at the governance side, if you like, of knowledge management. It's consistent with other management systems like ISO 9001, the quality management system, or the asset management system, or the all those various ISO standards. They've got a consistent set of management standards, so they can be bolted together, if you like, into a super system. It's an attempt to make sure that we are consistent in management terms about how we manage knowledge, and by doing so, stop us falling into some of the traps of the past, such as the purely technology view of KM, or the some of the more some of the approaches we know fail. It will help you self-audit if you wish to. And it's worth stressing, Judy will back me up on this, it's put together by unpaid volunteers. None of us earned any money writing this standard, but we believed it was important. So I think that busts some of the myths of ISO standards. Here's some more. They don't define how you run your business. They are guidance, and you define what to do and how to do it. It's almost like a set of pigeonholes, and you decide what you put in those pigeonholes, so long as there's something in each one. They're not only for big business, any level of organization. If it's got more than one person involved, this standard will be useful. The smaller organizations can use it to put in solid foundations from the start of their KM journey. The big ones can use it to be really rigorous about how they manage knowledge management. It should not be a burden to implement. You could probably in a couple of hours have a good workshop with your team and come out with some really useful next steps. Or you could do a full audit and really drill down into what you need to do. And there is no need to certify. You can implement the standard and you can claim to be compliant, and nobody's going to argue with you. But for some organizations, certification is important, and I'll talk about why in a moment. Many of you, the majority of you, want to use the standard as a guide, and that's a very, very valid thing to do, especially for those organizations starting in KM. It tells you what to think about at the start. The standard is worked out in a very logical set of components. It starts with the overview, what you're trying to achieve, who are the stakeholders, then it goes into the detail of the system, then it goes into the various elements that support that system. So I think if I was starting knowledge management again, I would find this a very useful structure to work through. And by putting in place everything that's required by the standard, by filling every one of those pigeonholes, you make sure you haven't left anything out and you don't fall into any of the gaps. Sulpat saying it's one of my favorite documents so far, very useful. That's really nice to know. Thank you. If you want to audit against the standard, yes, you can do. And actually, the standard requires some level of self-audit. You can use internal auditors, external auditors. I think self-audit by the team, the knowledge management team, is always difficult because there is this confirmation bias. You know, you read a section called leadership and you say, oh yes, our leadership is supportive of KM, tick, we've done that section. Whereas an auditor from outside the team might say, hang on, where's your proof? Where's your proof of this, 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 and this? The standard has got 58 uses of the word shall in the document. And every one of those shall statements is something that you are required to do to be compliant with the standard. You can miss one or two and still get a pass mark, but not the big ones and not very many. So that's what an auditor would do, is look for the evidence that you are addressing those 58 shall statements and then document that level of compliance. Look for areas of non-compliance and suggest ways forward to improve your internal knowledge management system. You can be certified if you want to be, and there are, I think, a few reasons why it would be useful to be able to show compliance with the standard. Firstly, it's for your team, not necessarily show, but check compliance with the standard. For your team, it's very useful to know, are we missing anything? For your management, it's very useful for them to know, are they missing anything? Is there anything that they could do to help you become more compliant? For the organization, I've heard this from a few people, the fact that there is an ISO standard for knowledge management somehow legitimizes it as a discipline. And that will be very useful to you, I think, going forward. But sometimes it's useful externally. It's sometimes useful for a service organization to demonstrate to its clients that they are managing knowledge in a responsible way. Or if you are bidding for work with a client, it can go in your bid that we are compliant with ISO 30401. So if you want us to manage knowledge on your behalf, we can show that we can do that properly. Questions so far, questions and comments. And there's a good one there from Eleanor that might be a good one to start with, saying, well, I'm thrilled there's a standard with a single focus on KM. Now it's difficult to move into wider adoption stage because there are, yeah, and that's an interest about it with formal certification and whether other standards are enough for an organization. And there is a little bit of cover for KM in ISO 9001, but ISO 9001 is not a knowledge management standard. So I think you're right, Eleanor. It's not going to be as widely adopted yet as ISO 9001 because 9001 has become a certification industry almost, and that drives demand. I don't think we need a certification industry for KM, but we at least now have that standard to measure ourselves against. Will it drive adoption? I don't know. I think it's early days. There are auditors out there. There's Ian is telling us there are 4 certified auditors and 7 certified organizations. So if you want certification against the standard, it can be done. But does it need to be done? Perhaps not. What else do you think? Any other questions? We're talking broadly now about the standard itself before we go on to talk about the guide. Does it help drive best practice and good adoption? I think if people follow it and are compliant with it, then yes. What do you think, Judy?
I think when we set out, and I'm talking really about the UK team in particular now, when we set out and to develop the standard, the big thing that we wanted to do was to end the confusion about knowledge management, especially things like confusion between knowledge management and information management. And that can't be measured by the number of people that are certified against the standard. But I think it has reinvigorated interest in knowledge management. And especially, as you said, Nick, it has legitimised knowledge management. Lots of people have said that to me as well. Yeah.
Zulpat is saying that she prefers to certify, and I think there's a lot. If you want to certify, the standard is absolutely designed to be certified against. There are those 58 shall statements. If you comply with each of those, Zulpat, then you can be certified, whether you self-certify or seek external help. Ralph is asking, can we comment on take-up in the corporate vs public sector, NGO and charity? No, I can't, Ralph, because I don't have that level of information.
Does Ian know? Does Ian know who the 7 certified organisations are? My understanding is that there are quite a lot of several of those 7 at least are in the Middle East. Do you know, Ian? No, he's not going to tell us.
Yeah.
UAE has public sector. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Ian. And Hank agrees as well. Sorry, yes, Hank, I should have asked you as well.
Yeah. So there is certification going on, and if it's important to you, it can be done. But Ralph, we don't have enough data yet, and I'm not sure how we would get data about take up by various industry sectors. I think next time I do a global survey, I'll probably actually I could deconvolve the survey that I've got, because for each of the people who answered, there's a sector. We know what sector they came from. But I think that was quite early days, and I did that survey. So, Ralph, I'll let you know in another couple of years on the take up by different sectors. There
was a good point from Eleanor as well about clients driving the levels of certification.
Yeah,
it has become, and you said that the quality standard has become a certification industry. And that's largely driven by clients making it a requirement, say with environmental management.
Yes, I know of many examples where big organizations and governments, particularly in military parts of governments, have made it a requirement in contracts that the supplier should demonstrate good practice in knowledge management. And nowadays, of course, you can demonstrate good practice through compliance with the standard. So I think there will be a client drive over time. And talking of time, I'm watching the clock, and I think it's probably time to move on to the body of this talk, which is not about the standard itself. It's about the guide that we're writing now. Now, whether you are intending to use the standard itself as a guide, or whether you are intending to certify against it, we decided that you need something to help you. If you read the standard, it's fairly arcane language. It can be difficult to follow at points, and the logic behind many of the shall statements just is not there. It tells you what you shall do or what you are required to do, but it doesn't tell you what your options are to meet those requirements. Therefore, the British Standards Institute decided to write a guide to the implementation of ISO 30401. This is a British product. It's aimed at the British market. It's written in British language. One of the issues with the standard itself is that it had to be written in such a way as to be easily translated into French, German, and Russian, and a few other languages, which meant that many of the phrases that we are used to in English just wouldn't work. Knowledge flow, for example, lots of us like the phrase knowledge flow, apparently was untranslatable. And we ended up with more complicated language, such as knowledge conveyance and transformation. So part of what we're looking to do here is explain what that means. This guide will itself be a standard. It'll be ISO 304, not ISO, it'll be BSI 30402, but it's not a compliance standard. So we can't, it's not something to certify against. It is a standard guide to a certification standard. It's being produced by the BSI Mirror Committee, which is the group of us in the UK who shadowed the working group from ISO. And Judy and I and John Fryer from the British Library are the current drafting team. We've just finished the first draft, which is going to go to the committee shortly. Why a guide? I think I've just said this because the standard is not easy to follow. The language is clumsy and it tells you what to do, but not how to get there. So we felt another level of aid and support was needed. Being a standard, it goes through the same steps as any standard. We are just coming to the end of stage 2.0, the preparatory stage where we're completing the working draft. It goes to the committee, probably in a couple of months when the editorial work is complete. And the BSI committee will come out with a committee draft. And then it goes out to inquiry. And this is where all of you can be involved. Any of you, and we'll ask you to signify your level of involvement later on. Any of you can, at this point, when it gets to 4.0, you can comment on the guide to the standard. Once we've got the public comments, we take them all back. We have a massive, exhausting couple of days pulling all of those together and coming out with a final draft. Everybody's comment is reviewed. No comments are rejected without reading and discussion. Most of them are adopted in that they have some impact on the way the standard is written. The guide to the standard will be written. Okay, so what is in the guide to the standard? The guide to the standard, we decided, will follow very closely the structure of the standard itself. And our vision is that, you know, you can have the standard on your desk, you can have the guide on your desk, you can put them side by side and you can read across from one to the other. What the guide cannot do is reproduce the language of the standard because it's a separate product and there are copyright issues. But we have made sure that they match clause by clause so that as you read through the standard, as you read the standard clause, you've got the guidance alongside. The only difference is the introduction and the annexes. And there we have gone as far off piste as we like, and we've written our own stuff, but with a view to being helpful. And what I'm going to do now, and this is going to be fairly dull and boring, but stick with me. I'm going to go through these sections one by one. I'm going to tell you what's in there and what these sections try to do. And at the end of that section, we will be interested in your feedback. Is there anything we've missed? Is there anything we need to put in the guide? And also, would you like to be involved in that public inquiry step? So starting with the introduction. And we got the comment back recently that this is the longest introduction to a BSI guide that this person has ever seen. And we're quite pleased with that because this is where we wanted to get the bulk of our explanation in, to explain what a standard is and why a standard is structured the way it is and why so much text is identical in ISO 9001, ISO 30401, ISO 40401. And the reason for that is that there is standard text that all management system standards have, because ISO believes that every management discipline has many things in common with all the other disciplines. Throughout the standard, and therefore throughout the guide, is this concept of a plan, do, check, act cycle. ISO believes that is a common underpinning for any management system, that you plan what you're going to do, you do it, you check whether you've done it, and if you haven't, you act upon it. So all of that's explained in the introduction. Similarly, the KM principles that are mentioned in the standard, we give a lot more background to those. And we talk about things like strategic and tactical KM, because we don't want people just to think this is a tactical exercise. We want them to realize that there's a real strategic input here. So that's the introduction. That's probably about 30% of the volume of the guide. Then we move into the clauses one by one. And 1, 2, 3 are very simple clauses. We don't really say much about those. Clause 3 in the standard is the definitions. And all we've done in the guide is put in something about the updates to the definitions, because there is always a continuous cycle of update. So we include what has changed since the guide was published. So these are fairly minor. We hit the meat of the standard when we get to clause 4. And this is where the shall statements begin. Clause 4 is it's the introductory pieces. It's about it's about why knowledge management is being done, and for whom and for what purpose. And it's about the different elements of the way knowledge works that should be visible within the organization. So there's quite a lot of guidance and quite a lot of comments in this section. In the slides that I'm going to go through now, the next half a dozen, 8 slides, maybe 10. On the left of the screen is an overview of what the guide contains. And on the right of the screen is a small snippet of text that I've taken out of the guide and plopped onto the page. It's not, what you see here under clause 4.1. There's a lot more about in the guide about clause 4.1, but this is just an illustration of the sort of stuff that's in there. So 4.1, understand the organization and its context. The standard asks you that you shall produce a list of issues that may affect the outcome of the knowledge management system. And what we do in the guide is we say, well, what sort of issues are you talking about? What's an example issue? How might you get that list of issues? So the issues might be, we're moving to a hybrid working model, or we're moving to a new desktop platform, or we're growing beyond our head office and suddenly we need to put knowledge out to staff, or we've got all of these things going on in different geographies and we need to share best practice or share knowledge across geography. You'll have your own list of issues. And the organizational strategy is a very informative way to find those issues. And in some cases in the guide, we actually say, look, here's a good example that you can look at. The example we've chosen for this particular clause is the Oxfam strategic plan, which very clearly says, here's our outcome goals, here's our operational goals, and here is the knowledge management outcomes and objectives that sit underneath that. And that is a beautiful way of working down from issues down to knowledge management outcomes. And if Oxfam wanted to be certified against the standard, I think they would show this to the auditor, and the auditor would say, yes, that's good. You've got your list of issues. Carrying on, clause 4. Clause 4 is quite a big one. Sometimes we've put in what we think might be useful ways of demonstrating what you're doing. Here we've got a cross-plot table of clause 4.4.4, which is the rows, which are the main enablers of knowledge management, against the columns, which are the main steps in the knowledge management life cycle, if you would allow that particular term. And by plotting this out as a row of pigeonholes, you can demonstrate that each of these pigeonholes are full and that you have got a knowledge management system that addresses both the columns and the rows. Again, this could be a useful thing for you to show to an auditor, particularly if you have behind each of these some documentation that defines how those processes work, what those roles are, and so on. Janine loves the idea of including examples. And yeah, that's why we're doing this, Janine. I think if you can show how other people do it, you don't copy it, but it gives you some inspiration.
We hope nobody copies it.
We hope nobody copies it. Clause 5. Clause 5 is an interesting one. It's about leadership, and it takes three views of leadership. One is the support from senior management, one is the delegation of authority, and one is knowledge management policy. And we know that leadership is very important. So what we explain in the guide is how these leadership elements may be demonstrated. Firstly, you've got to acquire the leadership support, but then you've got to be able to demonstrate to an auditor or to your internal team that you've got that. Similarly, knowledge management policy, similarly, chain of accountabilities. So the text on the right is talking about the level of leadership being determined by the scope of the management system, the scope being defined in 4.3. And if your scope is only the R&D section, then it's only really the head of R&D who needs to be giving their support. If your scope is the entire organization, then the support has to come from the very top. And then we give you some ways in which, and some examples of how that accountability can cascade down to different levels. We talk about the policy. And the policy may be a new document to many organizations, but ISO believes that if you really want to demonstrate leadership commitment, you need a policy. I was consulting to an organization for several years, and I kept saying to them, where's your policy? Where's your policy? And they said, oh, we don't think we need one. And I pointed out to them that they had online their operational manual, which had a policy for absolutely everything except knowledge. And you think, if that's the case, what message does that send? So ISO will require a policy, and this may be a new document that you need to write. We've included in the guide, let me just turn the highlighter on, this text from Ed Hoffman from NASA, which I really like. And he talks about the messages that a policy sends, declaring that as an organization, we see this as important, that people are taking accountable for taking action, indicating that the organization and its leaders want to make sure things are done the right way. A policy is, well, you're going to need one if you want to be compliant. But we explain why and what it might look like and how you might construct it. Clause 6 is about planning. You have your outcomes, you have your objectives, you have your issues, and you can plan to avoid the risks and capitalize on the enablers. And you have your operational plans. And so in this section, we talk about what sort of operational plans you might have. Plans for major projects and programs like NASA do, plans for various operational departments, plans for communities of practice like Fluor have. Knowledge management plans can exist at a number of levels, and you would want to be able to demonstrate that you have these plans in place. We also have got a table in there that explains how you start with a policy, and then you sort of nest out of that all the plans that are needed to deliver that policy. Clause 7, support. Support is support in many different ways. The strategy, the standard requires you to talk about resources, competence, awareness, communication, and documented information. This is documented information as a support to the knowledge management system, and it requires all of these elements of support to be in place. So what we tried to do in the guide is to discuss how you can do that. How can you demonstrate competence, for example? How can you demonstrate awareness? The little snippet I've put in over here is talking about competency, and we're looking at competency perhaps in 3 classes of people: those with a KM role to play, those who are in the KM team, and those who are just users of the system. They need to be competent about how that system is used, which means you need to demonstrate that you've given them enough guidance for them to be competent. So awareness, awareness, you can demonstrate that you've got awareness programs in place, for example, like the November campaign they have in Floor and the NHS now, or the knowledge weeks that they have at the European Space Agency. If you can, that's the sort of proof that you require to show an auditor that you are addressing the issue of awareness, and so on and so on. And the guide takes you through all of this. Now, I said this was going to be boring, didn't I? But we're just working through it step by step, and we're nearly there. Don't worry. Clause 7 addresses the issue of documented information. And that is not every piece of documented information in the, thank you, Annette. Annette's saying, no, it's not boring. It's not every bit of documented information in the organization. It's documented information relevant to the KM system, and by extension to some of the content it produces. And we need to make sure that that documented information is managed properly, that you have confidentiality, that you have availability, that you have ownership, that you have update and oversight, that you have control of documents. So over here we can see in a little bit of text saying, here are the principles: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is what they mean. And these are ways in which the KM system can demonstrate this. And then there's a big list of things that you should have in place, that we recommend you should have in place. Now, the guide is, you don't have to follow everything we say in the guide, because it is not an accreditation standard. But what we're trying to do is help you meet the accreditation standard. Clause 8. Clause 8. When we wrote Clause 8, we made it quite brief. With hindsight, perhaps we should have made it a bit longer. Clause 8 is about the operation of the KM system. And I think we thought at the time that KM systems are operated in so many different ways that we can't be too elaborate about what you need. But still, operation is an important asset, an important component. So what we put in the guide is how operational processes can be defined, how they can be controlled, and particularly how you can do this when they've been outsourced. No organization works alone. Very often it works in partnership with others. And therefore, we need to make sure that these processes are controlled, whoever manages them. And we talk about what control means over here. We've got a long list that I've cut short. And we talk about the issue then of process controller. Who's going to be the process controller for KM processes? Things that you need to think about. And I think you're right, Nancy. It is food for thought. And what we're trying to do in the guide is say, this is what you need to really think about. 2 more clauses. Clause 9, performance management. This is about metrics, internal audit, and management review. And the standard requires you to have a measurement of the performance of the knowledge management system. Now, knowledge management systems can perform in many ways. Therefore, you may have a large set of metrics to apply. And so you can see at the bottom of this text here, we're leading on to a list of types of metric that you could apply to your knowledge management system. So whenever I say knowledge management system, I'm not talking about an IT system. You all realize we're talking about a management system here. So we give you help on metrics. We give you help on internal audit. The standard doesn't stipulate any need for external audit, but it does require you to do regular internal audit. As it says, independent, periodic, and regular review by the internal audit process. So we talk about what that might look like and who you might involve. We put in, there's a charts or diagrams about the reporting lines that you might have, because management review is an important part of the standard that you have to comply with. And finally, the clause on improvement. And you can improve the knowledge management system in a number of ways. You can take corrective action if there is any gap, or you can look at continuous improvement and refresh of the knowledge management system itself. And one of the things that we suggest is that you look at this in 3 levels: single loop, double loop, treble loop. The single loop is there one component that's not working well? Can we fix it? Double loop is our operational assumptions and our management objectives. Are they still right, or should we fix those? And the triple loop is to say, well, have all the issues changed? Has the context changed? Have the stakeholders changed? Is the world now completely different? And we need to rethink the whole thing from the start.
Or did we not understand it?
Or did we not understand it? Yeah.
In the triple loop.
Absolutely.
Not always a change.
Now, that's the... I'm looking at the time. We've got 12 minutes left, so I won't take questions now. But before we go on to the annexes, we'd like to do a little poll again. And Nancy, have you got this one set up for us? What we'd like to do is check, this out of our interest, really, the understanding of the term explicit knowledge. Which of these 3 most closely matches how you understand the term explicit knowledge? Is it knowledge which has been explained in some way, spoken or recorded, or knowledge which has been recorded in files and documents, or is it knowledge which can be explained but may or may not have been? So which of these would you most typically agree with? And don't be swayed by what other people are saying. Say what you really think.
Be brutal.
Be brutal.
And Nick, do you want me to ask the question about what's missing as well? Should I start?
No.
Okay,
We'll do that later on, Nancy, in about 5 minutes' time.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so what we're seeing as this builds up. No, we've only got 69% of people participated.
Oh.
Will that do, or do you want a few more?
It might be tricky for some people if they're the way they're connecting.
Might be. All right. Well, let's stop there. We got 70%. Okay, half of them have gone for that middle one, B, knowledge which has been recorded. A quarter have gone for the top one, knowledge which has been explained. A quarter have gone for that bottom one, knowledge which can be explained but may or may not have been. That's really quite interesting. You will, careful readers of the standard will notice we do not use the terms tacit and explicit, and this is why. Because there is a wide range of understanding of what those terms mean. There is the academic understanding, which is probably the bottom one. And there is the widespread understanding, which is probably the middle one. But if we were to use those terms, then people would read them and understand them in a completely different way. So there are some terms which the standard does not use. And we explain in the annex what those terms are and why we don't use them. What the standard uses primarily is talking about codified and uncodified knowledge, which certainly originally we meant documented and undocumented. Because in management terms, that's where you have one of the big divides. If knowledge is undocumented, it can only be shared person to person. If it's documented, then you don't need the person involved, even though you've lost a vast amount of quality in the documented process. David Williams says, my view is if it's been recorded, then it's information. Yes, that is another view. And
David and I have been talking about this.
Yeah. So I think if all of us talked about it, we would come out with multiple views. So it's really, 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 really difficult to write a guide which uses terms with so many different levels of understanding. So Annex A talks about this. It introduces some of the various models of knowledge like Cook and Blackler. It talks about KM and AI because there we have another minefield. The AI people use knowledge to mean things that we would not understand our knowledge at all. So this tries to unpick, it doesn't give you an answer, but it tries to unpick why there is such a confusion. And it's good for people to be aware of that before they start. And then finally, Annex B. Annex B gives us some examples. And again, this is not something that anybody should copy. But I remember when we were first writing the standard itself, we got feedback saying that a set of examples was a very, very helpful thing. Now, that wasn't appropriate to put in the standard, but we've put it in the guide, and we've put the examples in by industry segment. And I think all of us know that, for example, legal knowledge management has got a flavor of its own. Process-based or practice-based knowledge management has got a flavor of its own. So we've put in examples of typical knowledge management systems for different industries, purely for illustrative purposes, not to be copied or used as templates, but to spark people's thinking. So there we go. That's the guide. A couple of questions for you. Firstly, when we release the guide for public review, would you like to be consulted? Would you like to be notified? If so, could you put your email address on the chat window now or send it to Nancy? I can hear a lot of tapping going on.
And Ian Fry, Ian, we need to talk to you, I think, about working together a bit. It's a bit tricky because it is a BSI standard, and no, we're not supposed to share it with people. But we're getting closer to the point where we officially can, and then we can have a discussion with you about it, I think.
Yeah, I understand that, Judy.
Okay. Good. So that's the first question. And many of you are putting your email addresses into the chat. We will save the chat. If you don't want to write your email address out in public, then send it to Nancy. Second question. Is there one thing we must be sure we include in the guide? And if so, what is it? Again, please answer that in the chat. And while people are doing that, I think we've still got time for a few questions. How are we doing for time, Nancy? Have we got a hard stop at 1 or?
Yes, we've probably got about 4 minutes.
Yeah.
We do have an unanswered question in the chat, which I am looking for. And how does one become an auditor for the standard? what are the organisations that govern the process of certification? So these are the accreditation bodies. Nick, do you want to have a go at that? I'm not sure I can answer that very well.
There are a number of levels of accreditation. The first would be why you would want to be an auditor for the standard. I don't know. I think it sounds like a terrible job.
Yeah.
You would need to be trained and accredited by a certification body, of which there are many. That's the first level. The second level is where that certification body itself is certified by a national accreditation body. In the UK, we have UCAS, who are the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, and they accredit organizations to certify against different standards. And at the moment, they're not accrediting anybody to certify against in the UK to certify against ISO 30401. Now, that doesn't stop you finding an auditor who has been trained by a certification body that hasn't yet been accredited by ACAS. Oh, sorry, not ACAS, UCAS. So there are levels of doing it. And who was asking?
It was Annette, I think.
Not sure it was.
I might be wrong.
Was it Elodie?
Eleanor.
I'm fine.
Yeah. Well, whoever it was, if you want to become an auditor, then you have to, Eleanor it was, then you have to find an organization who will train you. And there is such an organization. You go to Patricia Eng in the US. Her organization will do it. There are other organizations in other countries who will accredit you as an auditor.
Thank you, Nick. It was more the question of actually how all these bodies which certify auditors are connected between, and so they are acting on the same level. So as a client, if I want to choose one, I'm certain that it's single framework or whatever level of services.
I can't answer that. I don't think there is a mechanism for them to work together at the moment.
Does anybody know of one? Because I mean, I used to work in a lab, and so I'm very familiar with UCAS, and I'd be very surprised if they didn't have some sort of levelling up between the different national accreditation bodies, but I don't know what it is.
I don't know what it is either. No.
And it is possible that they don't. But it's what they do. It's they compare. Effectively, they compare performance, whatever the performance is, between different organisations, so that they are using the same standard to gauge performance.
Yes, I
think if they didn't do it themselves between different national accreditation bodies, it would be a little bit hypocritical, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would turn into a sort of Wild West.
Yes.
Who do you choose? Which may well be an argument at this stage for self-audit, or you choose wisely and you choose at the very least an auditor who has been trained by an accreditation agency who seems to know what they're doing. So if you're looking for an auditor, look wisely.
David has responded, Nick, to the question about is the one thing we must be sure we include in the guide. And I'm picking this out from several because I think it's an interesting one. Benefits of KM is what should be included in the...
Well, that's interesting because we haven't really touched that, have we?
Well, I think we haven't touched on it explicitly, but we've touched on it by talking about the structure of the standard, which is mirrored in the guide. Because I would say that the benefits of KM depend on what you're trying to achieve. You identify your own benefits like a project. This is what I want to do. This is how I'm going to do it. And the measure of the benefit is whether or not you achieve what it is you're trying to do.
What we talk about is outcomes, don't we?
We talk about outcomes. And
our assumption is an outcome is beneficial. Because what the guide and the standard, neither of which cover, is the issue of selling KM to your organization in the first place.
Or explaining it even.
Or even explaining it. The standard assumes that you have a knowledge management system in place and it gives you a benchmark to measure it against. And so I think it assumes that you already have an understanding of benefits. But I think, yes, let's think about that, whether we need to include anything in the guide, anything more specific.
Hi, can I just interrupt because we're on the hour? I know people have other commitments and we always try and finish. I'm happy to stay on for another 5 minutes because I can see the chat is still flourishing. But anyone that needs to go, I just wanted to thank Nick in front of you all for preparing and sharing this, especially with all the hard work, because it's opened all of our eyes to what more we can do, and we look forward to getting the guide to hopefully implement the standard a bit better. So thank you, Nick, for that. Do ask any more questions. I've got another 5 minutes and then close. So Judy, is there something particularly prevalent from the chat that we want to
there is quite a lot. Annette is talking about a German guide. And Annette, we are aware of this because of our ISO work.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to impose. So yeah.
No, we are aware of it. We're in a strange situation because we're working on a British standard that we're not supposed to share the details of it with anybody else. But actually, we want to collaborate with other countries, including Germany. That DIN guide, is that the one for SME, small and medium size?
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah, we are in touch with people. Mm-hmm. We are in touch with people.
Yeah.
We are managing knowledge, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The secrecy.
Even after the EU, let me say it like this, even after Brexit.
Well, and then there's another relevant comment about, which is again something that is at the back of our minds. Once BSI has produced this guide, we haven't got any firm intention yet, but it's something to discuss whether we should have it considered as the basis for an ISO guide.
Yeah,
and then we could now. Can we be candid, Nick? Do you think about why we decided to do it as a BSI guide? Not that candid. No, one of the things we found when we were preparing the ISO standard was that there are very, very different views about the nature of knowledge, and they do tend to. Some of it is big. Different people in different countries have different views. Which is why we didn't address any of the things like what is explicit knowledge, what is tacit knowledge in the standard itself. We wanted the opportunity to produce something where we didn't have to, something that would be useful in the UK, where we didn't have to, we could acknowledge these other views of knowledge, but we didn't have to go into great detail and explain all of them. And that's what that Annex A is. It includes all the things about different views of knowledge. Having gone through the process, I think we might be, we're in a better place to possibly offer it as the basis for an ISO standard. But it would then, of course, go to the ISO working group, which we're members of, and it would be changed.
Yeah. I also see there's some very useful suggestions in the comments here. I'd like to pick up one. From Maheen about the impact of remote working on KM systems. And I think that is something that we have gone back and retrofitted since COVID. But the problem there being nobody's really got a good idea of how KM works in remote remote organizations, other than knowing that it doesn't work very well. So I think we have put some of that in, but it might be worth revisiting again during the public consultation.
Yeah, it's too soon really to have for things to have settled down enough for there to be anything. What exists is the good practice that existed before when people did.
There have been some papers published, and a lot of them are saying that organisations are becoming more siloed. So the job of a KM professional is to, manage this, to stop that from happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, but without without actually having anything concrete to suggest.
Well, there is good practice that was around before COVID.
Oh, there is, yes.
And that is established enough to put in any standard guide, whatever.
I think so.
And it's being repeated. I've noticed it being repeated again. But of course, the global nature of COVID means that people are experiencing difficulties that on a different scale.
And a lot of the guidance, to be honest, is about virtual teams and virtual teamwork.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah,
which is not necessarily virtual cross-team knowledge sharing.
They're more bubbles. It's the networks and communities that break those boundaries.
Yeah, and they're the ones that are suffering. They're the components that are suffering.
I'm going to have to call time, Judy and Nick. Okay. I'm really sorry.
All right. It's fine, Nancy.
Just because we've kept to these times before, I think what I hope is that with the comments, the very intelligent comments that people have made, that you've got key people to follow up with and the volunteers. And if we can want to have on another session, just a discussion session, it could definitely there's appetite for it. But I'll leave that for you two to think about. But this group, I can see it's enlightened. And there's much more we can do in this space. So I'm happy to facilitate that if that's helpful, but I'll leave it for you guys to think.
Could you save the chat, please, Nancy?
Yeah, of course. You'll have a copy of that. I won't circulate that to everyone like we normally do because it's got obviously people's contact details.
There are some
the slides and the recording will be shared with everyone else.
If any, there are some unanswered questions and suggestions. So if anybody wants to, you've got Nick's contact details. Well, you'll see them when you get the slides. If anybody wants to follow up.
Yeah, and he will be copied, in the email like I do afterwards. Then you'll have Nick's details in that
and
as well.
I'm happy to join in if anybody's got any. I can see there are lots of issues. We haven't.
And I hate to do this, but I think it warrants a whole separate conversation with you all. But thank you, Nick. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for all your great participation. Is there any one last thing, Judy or Nick, that you want to cover before we close?
No, I think it's lunchtime.
My belly's rumbling.